Ethan Caldwell had built his grocery chain from the ground up. What started as a single store had expanded into a thriving network of 12 locations across the state. He had always taken pride in offering top-tier customer service, but lately something felt off. Complaints were rising, long lines, rude employees, and worst of all, reports that elderly customers were being mistreated. Corporate reports didn't give him the full picture. He needed to see it for himself. So Ethan decided to go undercover. He transformed his appearance, trading his tailored suits for a plain polo and khakis, swapping his well-groomed beard for rough stubble, and slipping on thick-rimmed glasses. His new name tag read Eric. Most of his employees had never met him in person, so blending in wouldn't be hard. Ethan chose the worst-performing store, a mid-sized location in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The store manager, Rick, had been with the company for years, but lately, complaints about his leadership had been piling up. Ethan needed to find out if the concerns were real or just exaggerated. On his first day, the assistant manager, Lisa, gave him a quick tour. She looked exhausted, her eyes weary but kind. She juggled a dozen tasks while explaining the basics. The registers freeze sometimes, so be patient, she warned, then hesitated before adding in a lower voice, and if you hear Rick say something, just ignore him. That wasn't a good sign. Ethan spent the next few hours at the register ringing up customers. Most were polite, though some were impatient. That didn't bother him. What did was how tense the employees seemed, constantly glancing toward Rick's office, like they were bracing for something. And then he saw why. Rick stomped out of his office like a storm rolling in. He was a stocky man with a permanent scowl, his presence alone sending a wave of unease through the store. He hovered near the registers, arms crossed, watching Ethan work. Then an elderly woman approached. She moved slowly, carefully placing a small basket of groceries on the conveyor belt. Her frail hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her wallet. Rick let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Here we go again," he muttered. Ethan frowned, keeping his expression neutral. "Everything okay?" he asked. Rick scoffed. "These old folks take forever. They count their pennies, ask dumb questions, and hold up the line. I swear they should have their own damn store." Ethan's stomach twisted. The elderly woman froze, clearly having heard him. A flush of embarrassment spread across her wrinkled cheeks as she fumbled with her purse, her fingers shaking. "I'm sorry," she murmured, barely above a whisper. "I just need a moment." Rick plastered on a fake smile, his voice dripping with condescension. "Take your time, ma'am," he said. Then, under his breath but still loud enough for Ethan to hear, he muttered, "Not like anyone else has places to be." Ethan's hands clenched beneath the register. His heart pounded. This was worse than he had expected. Lisa, standing nearby, shot Ethan an apologetic look but said nothing. Her posture was stiff, her lips pressed into a tight line. She looked afraid. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. But inside he was seething. This wasn't just bad management. This was disrespect. And Ethan Caldwell wasn't about to let it slide. Ethan finished ringing up the elderly woman's groceries, carefully placing each item into her cart. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "No rush at all." She smiled at him, gratitude flickering in her tired eyes. With a small nod, she shuffled away, her frail hands gripping the handle of the cart. Rick scoffed beside him, shaking his head. "You'll learn, kid," he muttered. "These seniors are a waste of time. They barely spend any money and they slow everything down." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to snap, to tell Rick exactly what he thought of him right then and there, but he wasn't finished yet. He needed to see how deep this problem ran. So, for now, he stayed quiet. He forced himself to keep working, though his fingers gripped the register a little too tightly. Rick's words echoed in his head. "Is this how my customers are treated when I'm not around?" As the shift continued, Ethan watched closely. The employees weren't lazy. If anything, they were overworked and anxious. Lisa, the assistant manager, practically ran the floor on her own. She darted between tasks, managing the registers, handling customer complaints, and even stocking shelves when no one else could. The cashiers flinched whenever Rick passed by, their shoulders tensing like they were bracing for impact. The stock clerks moved quickly, keeping their heads down to avoid catching his attention. And then there was the schedule. During a brief lull, Ethan slipped into the break room and studied the schedule taped to the wall. It didn't take long for a disturbing pattern to emerge. Certain employees, older workers, quieter ones, and those who didn't fake a laugh at Rick's crude jokes, had the worst shifts. They were scheduled for relentless hours, exhausting closing to opening shifts, or barely any hours at all. Meanwhile, Rick's favorites, those who stayed on his good side, got full, stable shifts. Lisa had the worst of it. She didn't just manage, she did everything. She ran between departments, covered for missing staff, and absorbed the stress of an entire store on her shoulders. Ethan saw the exhaustion written across her face. At one point, she rubbed her temples as if trying to fight off a headache, her movements sluggish from sheer fatigue. And then Rick made it worse. Lisa walked past his office, moving toward the stockroom when his voice barked through the air. "Lisa, what the hell are you doing?" She stopped mid-step, startled. "I was just—" "You're not paid to run around like a damn headless chicken," Rick snapped. "You're paid to manage. So manage. And don't come crying to me about being tired." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. A beat of silence passed, then, without another word, she turned and grabbed a mop, quietly heading toward a spill near the dairy aisle. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had seen enough. But he wasn't done yet. During break, Ethan sat in the employee lounge, pretending to scroll through his phone while listening to the hushed conversations around him. "I can't keep doing this," one cashier muttered to another, voice low. "Rick cut my hours again. Meanwhile, his buddies get full shifts." The other cashier sighed. "Yeah, and did you hear what he said to Mrs. Thompson earlier? She's been coming here for years, and he told her she should shop online instead of wasting space." Ethan's grip tightened on the table. His stomach twisted. Mrs. Thompson. He knew that name. She had been a loyal customer since the company's early days. The first cashier shook his head. "I'd quit if I could," he admitted bitterly. "But everywhere else is just as bad." Ethan stole a glance at Lisa. She sat at the far end of the room, staring into her coffee like she was hoping it might give her the energy she desperately needed. The weight on her shoulders was obvious. The way she slouched, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she hadn't spoken a single word since sitting down. Then, just as the tension in the room started to ease, the door swung open. Rick walked in. The conversation died instantly. Employees stiffened, their eyes dropping to their laps or to their phones, pretending to be busy. The air in the room shifted. What had been quiet fatigue turned into suffocating dread. Rick smirked. "Why so quiet?" No one answered. He didn't care. He strode to the fridge, grabbed a soda, then turned toward Lisa. "By the way..." Rick took a long sip from his soda, barely glancing at Lisa. "I need you to cover tomorrow morning. Greg's out." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "But I already opened today, and I'm scheduled to close." Rick shrugged. "Not my problem." He cut her off before she could argue. "Figure it out." And with that, he popped the cap off his drink and walked out, leaving Lisa standing there, exhaustion written all over her face. Ethan clenched his fists. He had seen enough. That night, Ethan went home, his mind racing. "This is my company. I built it on respect, on service, on valuing people. And one of my own managers is tearing it apart." Observing wasn't enough anymore. Tomorrow he was going to take action. He arrived early the next morning. But this time he wasn't just another cashier. Today he was the owner. And today everyone, including Rick, was going to find that out. Ethan walked in as Eric one last time, scanning the floor. Rick was already there, barking orders at a stock clerk who scrambled to rearrange a shelf. Across the store, Lisa stood behind a register, her movements sluggish, dark circles under her eyes. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then, without hesitation, he strode past the aisles and straight into the manager's office. Rick barely looked up from his desk. What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Ethan shut the door behind him. "We need to talk." Rick scoffed. "You don't just walk into my office, kid. Get back to your register before I write you up." Ethan reached up and pulled off his glasses. Then, calmly, he removed his name tag and set it down on the desk in front of Rick. Rick frowned. "What are you?" Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'm Ethan Caldwell." Silence. The color drained from Rick's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Ethan didn't give him a chance to recover. He stepped forward, his tone firm but controlled. "I've spent the last 2 days working in this store, watching how you run things. And I have to say, I'm disgusted." Rick swallowed hard. "Sir, Save it." Ethan cut him off coldly. "I heard how you talk about the customers. I saw how you treat your employees. You mock elderly shoppers. You cut hours for workers you don't like. You overload Lisa while doing next to nothing yourself. And worst of all, you've created an environment where people are too afraid to speak up." Rick's expression hardened. He straightened, forcing his voice into something resembling confidence. With all due respect, you don't understand what it's like to run this place day to day, he shot back. I do what I have to do to keep things moving. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You think mistreating customers and employees is keeping things moving? Rick leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Look, these employees should be grateful they have jobs. If they can't handle it, they can leave. Simple as that. Ethan's jaw tightened. There it is. The exact attitude poisoning this store. And that, Ethan said, voice low but sharp as steel, is exactly the problem. You think this is about power? It's not. It's about respect. And I will not have someone like you running one of my stores. Rick's confidence wavered. For the first time he looked nervous. You can't just fire me. Ethan leaned in slightly. Yes, I can. His voice was quiet, but the finality in it was absolute. And I just did. Rick's face turned red. This is ridiculous. Do you know how hard it is to find managers willing to deal with this kind of work? Ethan didn't even flinch. I'll take my chances. He straightened, giving Rick a pointed look. Get your things. And leave. Now. Rick hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. But one look at Ethan's expression told him there was no arguing. Without another word, he grabbed his coat, muttering under his breath as he stormed toward the door. Ethan followed him out onto the store floor. Employees looked up, confused as Rick stomped past the registers toward the exit. Lisa stood frozen behind her counter, her hands gripping the edge. At the door, Rick paused and turned back to the staff. Good luck without me, he sneered. This place is a mess. You'll see. And then he was gone. Silence settled over the store. Employees exchanged uncertain glances, some looking at Ethan, others at Lisa. Ethan stepped forward. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked around at the employees, uncertainty still lingered in their eyes. I know this is a shock, he said, his voice clear and firm. But let me be absolutely clear. This store is not a mess. You all have been doing your jobs under terrible leadership. That changes today. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. Wait, who are you? Ethan turned to her. Ethan Caldwell. I own this company. And I've been working here undercover to see what's really going on. Gasps rippled through the employees. A few cashiers whispered in disbelief. A stock clerk's jaw nearly dropped. Lisa's mouth opened, then closed again. You were the new guy? Ethan nodded. And I saw everything. How you held this place together. How Rick treated you all. How customers were ignored or mistreated. That ends now. A stock clerk hesitantly raised his hand. Does this mean things are going to change? Ethan met his gaze. Yes. Immediately. Then he turned back to Lisa. I need to talk to you. In the office. Lisa tensed but nodded, following him inside. Lisa sat down slowly, still looking stunned. Ethan took a seat across from her. I've seen how hard you work, he said. You've been running this store without any recognition. That's going to change. Lisa blinked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I want you to take over as interim store manager. Lisa's eyes widened. Me? Ethan nodded. You're the only person here who actually cares about this place. And I trust you to rebuild what Rick broke. Lisa's hands trembled slightly. I don't know if I can. Ethan leaned forward. You already have been. You just didn't have the authority to do it. She swallowed hard, considering his words. Then slowly she nodded. Okay. Ethan stood. Good. Now let's go fix this store. Lisa followed him back onto the floor, where employees were still murmuring in hushed voices. Ethan clapped his hands to get their attention. Listen up. Rick is gone. Lisa is your new manager. And starting today we're making changes. He turned to the cashiers. Schedules will be fair, no more favoritism. To the stock clerks, breaks will be enforced, no more overworking. Then he addressed the entire staff. And most importantly, respect is mandatory. For customers and employees alike. A few people exchanged wary glances, still unsure. Ethan softened his tone. I know this won't fix everything overnight. But I promise you this, I'm listening now. And I won't stop. Slowly one cashier nodded. Then another. Lisa straightened her shoulders, her confidence growing. You heard him. Let's get back to work. For the first time since Ethan had arrived, the store felt lighter. Employees moved with purpose, not fear. And as he watched Lisa take charge, Ethan knew he had made the right decision. Ethan stayed the rest of the day, not as an undercover employee but as the owner, determined to set things right. At first, the atmosphere in the store was tense. Employees were unsure whether to believe the change was real. But then something shifted. Lisa stepped into her new role with quiet confidence. She checked in on cashiers, made sure stock clerks had help, and enforced breaks that had long been ignored. Employees who had once worked in fear now started to breathe a little easier. Ethan watched carefully, stepping in where needed but letting Lisa lead. She had earned this. By midday, the store was already changing. Lisa studied Ethan for a moment, then extended her hand. Ethan grasped it firmly, sealing an unspoken agreement. This wasn't just about fixing a broken store. It was about changing the culture from the ground up. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "For believing in us." Ethan shook his head. "I should have been here sooner. But I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere." Lisa smirked. "Good. Because we've got a lot of work to do." Ethan chuckled, nodding. "That we do." As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the store behind them no longer felt like a place weighed down by fear and exhaustion. It felt like a fresh start. Lisa locked the doors, then looked back at Ethan. "See you tomorrow, boss?" Ethan smiled. "See you tomorrow, manager." And with that, they parted ways, two leaders ready to build something better. Inside, the store stood quiet, but it was no longer just another workplace. It was becoming something more. A place of respect, fairness, and second chances. A place where people mattered. And that was just the beginning. Then shook Lisa's hand firmly, sealing their deal. "I guess we have a deal, boss," she said with a small smile. As he walked to his car, he stole a final glance at the store. It wasn't perfect yet. It wouldn't be overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he knew this was the company he had always meant to build. And this time he would make sure it stayed that way. Ethan didn't waste time. The next morning, before heading to corporate, he made an unannounced stop at another store in his chain, one known for high customer satisfaction and strong employee morale. He needed to see the contrast. The moment he stepped inside, the difference was obvious. The aisles were well stocked. Employees moved with purpose, their conversations light but professional. The atmosphere felt warm, inviting, not tense and exhausted. And most importantly, customers weren't just being served. They were being engaged. At one of the registers, a young cashier with an easy smile rang up a customer. "Take your time, ma'am." "No rush at all," he said kindly as the elderly woman counted out her change. Ethan felt a flicker of validation. This was how it was supposed to be. His eyes scanned the store until he spotted Carla, the store manager. She wasn't holed up in an office. She was on the floor, chatting with employees, helping a stock clerk rearrange a display, checking in with customers. She was leading. Ethan walked up to her. "Carla." She blinked in surprise before quickly shaking his hand. "Mr. Caldwell. Didn't expect to see you here today." Ethan gave a small smile. "That's the point. I wanted to see what a well-run store in my chain actually looks like." Carla chuckled. "Well, I hope we don't disappoint." Ethan glanced around. "From what I can see, you won't. But I want to know what makes this store work. What's different here?" Carla didn't hesitate. "Trust." Ethan raised an eyebrow and she continued. "I trust my employees to do their jobs and they trust me to have their backs. If there's a problem, we fix it, together. If someone's struggling, we figure out why instead of just cutting their hours. And customers? We treat them like people, not transactions." Ethan nodded slowly, her words hitting deep. That was exactly what had been missing at Rick's store. Carla frowned. "Which store are we talking about?" "The one Rick was running." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Ah, him." She shook her head. "I've heard stories. Never worked with him directly, but let's just say I'm not surprised." Ethan exhaled. He had let a toxic leader control one of his stores for far too long. But now he was finally taking control. And it was just the beginning. Carla folded her arms. "I know his type. Power-hungry. Thinks fear is the best motivator." Ethan exhaled. "Not anymore. He's gone." Carla gave a satisfied nod. "Good. But I'm guessing that store is still a mess." "Yes," Ethan admitted. "Lisa, Rick's former assistant, has taken over. She's capable, but his leadership beat her down. She needs support." Carla considered this. "Then give it to her. Pair her with someone who knows how to run a store the right way. Give her a mentor. If she's got the skills but lacks confidence, she just needs guidance." Ethan's mind was already turning. "Would you be willing to help?" Carla raised an eyebrow. "Me? You run one of the best stores in the company," Ethan said. "I trust you. If you're willing, I'd like you to check in at Lisa's store once a week. Help her stabilize things. Pass along what makes the store work. Carla leaned against a nearby counter, thinking, I don't want to step on her toes. You won't, Ethan assured her. She needs support, not someone taking over. You'd be there as a resource, not a replacement. Carla nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. Ethan extended his hand again. Thank you. She shook it firmly. Just make sure this isn't a one-time fix, Mr. Caldwell. If one store went that bad under your watch, others could too. Ethan met her gaze. I know. That's why I'm making changes at the corporate level too. Later that morning, Ethan arrived at headquarters, but instead of heading to his office, he called an emergency meeting with his district managers. The conference room filled with executives, some looking curious, others wary. Ethan stood at the front, hands resting on the table. Let's get straight to the point. I went undercover at one of our stores this week. What I saw was unacceptable. Murmurs rippled through the room. One of the district managers, Greg, leaned forward. Which store? Ethan's gaze flicked to him. The one Rick was running. Greg sighed. I had concerns about him, but his numbers always looked solid. Ethan's voice sharpened. And that's the problem. We've been measuring success the wrong way. The room fell silent. Numbers don't tell you if employees are being mistreated. They don't show if customers are being driven away, slowly, over time. They don't tell you if managers are running stores through intimidation instead of leadership. Denise, another district manager, frowned. What exactly did you see? Ethan didn't hold back. He told them about the way Rick disrespected elderly customers. The fear in the employees' eyes. How Lisa had been overworked and dismissed. He painted a clear picture of the toxic culture that had festered under Rick's leadership. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Denise exhaled. That's worse than I imagined. Greg rubbed his temples. We should have caught it. Ethan's tone was calm but firm. Yes, we should have. And it won't happen again. He turned to the projector, pulling up a new policy document. Effective immediately, we are changing how we evaluate store performance. It's not just about sales numbers anymore. Employee satisfaction, customer feedback, and leadership quality will weigh just as heavily. He clicked to the next slide. Every store will have anonymous employee feedback surveys every quarter. If a store has repeated complaints about leadership, we investigate. No exceptions. Another slide. And starting next month, I will personally visit each district stores, unannounced. Not as a CEO but as a customer. I want to see firsthand how each location is run. Greg leaned back, studying him. You're really serious about this? Ethan met his gaze. I built this company on the idea that we serve people. That includes our employees. If we lose sight of that, we don't deserve to succeed. Denise nodded. Then let's do it. No one argued. As the meeting ended, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time, control. Not the way Rick had craved it, through fear and intimidation, but real control. A clear direction. That evening, as Ethan left the office, his phone buzzed with a new message. Lisa, first full day without Rick. Feels different, in a good way. Staff is still adjusting, but we're getting there. Thanks for believing in me. Ethan smiled as he typed back. Keep going. You're not alone in this. As he put his phone away, he knew this wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about rebuilding the foundation